Alright everyone, today's video is about the mistranslation and misinformation surrounding the Chipekwe cryptid. We're going to move from South America, where the tapire iwara lives, into Africa, where the Mokele-mbembe and the Chipekwe are purported to live. Now the former, the Mokele-mbembe, has been, I think it's been done to death, really, and I think if I talked about it, I think I'd be boring the cryptozoology fans out there. You know, you've probably seen videos from other YouTubers discussing the dubious reports of the Mokele-mbembe from sources like William Gibbons and Roy Mackal, two very unreliable and biased sources, as the Mokele-mbembe translation is purportedly an account from Roy Mackal that states the translation as being "he who stops the flow of rivers." Now, this is the most common translation when speaking of the Mokele-mbembe of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but an interesting thing that people often miss out, an interesting detail, is that Roy Mackal actually discussed with an important figure in the Democratic Republic of the Congo about what Mokele-mbembe actually translates to. Now, the important figure actually said it translates to rainbow, and some figures that Roy Mackal has purportedly interviewed have stated that Mokele-mbembe doesn't even translate to anything at all, and that it is a made-up word composed of gibberish. It could very well be a term used, though some sources, like I said before, have stated that it is a made-up term, which I do actually find quite plausible. You know, this Roy Mackal has been very good at convincing people, especially young Earth creationists who are on his side and on his team. He's been very good at convincing them that these neo-dinosaurs, these modern dinosaurs that coexist with humans, he's been very good at convincing them that they still exist in rural and unexplored and remote parts of the world, which, like I've discussed in my previous video, is a very problematic idea. If you want to find out why this is a problematic idea and why I think it's a very racist idea, you should check that video out. It is part of the three-part series on misrepresented cryptozoological phenomena, much like this video, which is about the mistranslations in cryptozoology, which is a misrepresented cryptozoological factor that also often contributes to misjudged reports and dubious reports that I neglected in my video, which I really wish I'd discussed it more. But this is the video for that. Anyway, let's focus on the Chipekwe, which is a cryptid reported in Zambia. It's reported in the more central parts of Africa, where the Bemba language is spoken by, I think, more than 5 million people in Zambia. It is a Bantu language, which is a language, it's sort of an umbrella term for languages that encompass the more central and southern parts of Africa. Lingala being one of them, which I actually didn't know before researching for this video. Lingala is also a Bantu language, as is Bemba. And it is a very common language spoken by people in Zambia. And Chipekwe is a Bemba word that its translation has been debated, and it has been polarizing people for a while now. Now, from research I've done, the Chipekwe of Zambia appears to be a multitude of different creatures. I mean, it's truly extraordinary how many different accounts that change the description of the creature and change even the temperament of the creature. There's so many different accounts through the early to mid 1900s of this semi-aquatic animal. It's purported to be an ungulate, and it's quite similar in ways to an elephant or a rhino in terms of its coloration, its skin, and the presence of horns, and really its size and its lumbering habits through the waters of the Kafue Flats in Zambia and the Lake Bangweulu. Now, over the years, Chipekwe has come to mean a multitude of different things. I think the first instance of hearing of the word Chipekwe, the animal actually linked to a one-horned rhino that lived in the water, or a one-tusked elephant. Now, the reason why this is interesting to me is because we keep getting this theme of animals with one horn. Now, people actually use this to link it to the first report of the Chipekwe in 1907. Now, this was a few years after Zambia was changed from Rhodesia to Zambia, so that's just a bit of a time frame perspective for you. 1907 was the first instance of the Chipekwe being actually a physical animal, and a physical animal that's been purported to live in the waters from a second-hand account from 1907, and this was the first description of the creature, deeming it a sort of semi-aquatic rhino creature. Now, it's not exactly out of the realm of possibility. You don't necessarily, when you think of rhinos, you don't necessarily think of them being a semi-aquatic animal. They're usually more terrestrial, but I can't see this being out of the realm of possibility. It's just a rhino in the water. Not much has to be done or changed to, see a rhino in the water. Now, rhinos are actually very poor swimmers, so the most liquid-like substance you would probably see them in is mud to cool off and rid themselves of any parasites that they have. They would usually wallow in mud, not necessarily water. In fact, it's mainly the rhinos in Asia that are quite good at swimming. Rhinos in Africa are prone to drowning in deep water, so it would be quite unusual to see a rhino in water. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it's impossible. You might see a rhino in water. That doesn't necessarily mean it's its natural habitat. It could just be in there completely by chance. Who knows? This water rhino reported in 1907, when the native people first saw it, they could have seen it, and then a few hours later it drowned or something, or a few minutes later it just drowned, because they're not supposed to be in the water, which is probably why it caught people off guard. It would catch me off guard if I saw a rhino swimming in the water. I'd be like, hey, that's a weird looking hippo. The Chipekwe. So through the years, it's taken on many different forms. So the 1907 report of the water rhino being the first form that it took. The second notable instance was that Carl Hagenbeck and Hans Schomburg reported that the Chipekwe was actually sauropod-like. It was Carl Hagenbeck himself who was actually a worker for P.T. Barnum, he gathered many of P.T. Barnum's animals and attractions in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He actually believed it to be a sauropod-like creature, but this time with multiple horns on its head and a long neck. But this is the first time we are hearing of this description of it, Before, it was described as more rhino-like with one horn. Now it's said to have multiple horns and be more sauropod-like. Now, the reason I talk about this is because Hagenbeck and Schomburg's report from Lake Bangweulu actually led to an incident called the Great Brontosaurus Hoax, which, when I was researching this, I actually found it quite fascinating, because the Great Brontosaurus Hoax actually stemmed from a lot of the rumours that Hagenbeck and Schomburg were spreading, particularly about neo-dinosaurs in Africa, like the Chipekwe. So the Chipekwe actually contributed directly to rumours that turned out to be false from Hagenbeck, who believed it to be a living brontosaurus. Now, I shouldn't need to explain why Carl Hagenbeck and probably Schomburg are not reliable sources. Hagenbeck was directly linked to P.T. Barnum, who ran a circus. And at the time, P.T. Barnum was known for a lot of hoaxes. His job was to literally fabricate and stretch the truth of events to make his attractions seem more appealing. And obviously, if Carl Hagenbeck wasn't providing sufficient animals, they wanted to go above and beyond, he reported a sauropod to make it seem like Africa was this mysterious, dark continent and this unknown land that's not changed since the time of the dinosaurs, which is, like I said in my previous videos, a very stereotypical and untrue idea, bordering on derogatory at this point, because you are basically saying that the native people there are no less primitive than the creatures purported to live there, which is untrue. But yeah, Carl Hagenbeck is not a reliable source. Case closed, I think. I don't think we can really trust Carl Hagenbeck's report of the Chipekwe, but that doesn't mean there are a shortage of reports of the Chipekwe from that point. It doesn't mean people stopped believing in the Chipekwe. There were reports of the Chipekwe after this time, and in 1912, the Nsanga was actually linked to the Chipekwe. Now, the Nsanga is a completely separate cryptid, or it's purported to be a completely separate cryptid. And this is where it gets interesting, because the fact that the Nsanga has been linked to the Chipekwe actually corroborates reports of the translation of Chipekwe being just water monster. It doesn't have to be a brontosaurus, it doesn't have to be a one-horned rhino. It can be all of those things, like the Amela Ntuka and the Mokele Mbembe have actually been referred to as Chipekwe in history. The Nsanga and the Ichisongo, which is a completely similar cryptid, the Ichisongo, which is a one-horned rhino-like animal that killed hippos and ate grass, much like the early reports of the Chipekwe. The Nsanga, the Ichisongo, the Mokele Mbembe, and the Amela Ntuka have all been referred to as Chipekwes. Even one-tusked elephants have been referred to as Chipekwes. What this may suggest is that the Chipekwe isn't just one animal, it's multiple animals, Chipekwe, the most common translation I can find is just monster or water monster. Those are the two translations that I commonly found during my research, and they were really the only translations of Chipekwe that just generally referring it to a monster or an out-of-place creature. I suppose Chipekwe is the Bemba word for cryptid, really. Cryptid was probably not a well-known word at the time, and the word, especially to people of Africa who probably know creatures as more legendary or mythological or spiritual rather than cryptozoological. The Chipekwe was probably a more suited term because it was from their language and it referred to a monster or an out-of-place creature, much like cryptids do. So, I guess the Loch Ness Monster is a Chipekwe. The big cats of Great Britain, are they Chipekwes? If we're going by the monster definition of Chipekwe, then surely the Kasai Rex is a Chipekwe. Any out-of-place creature, particularly in the water in most instances, could be referred to as a Chipekwe. But I think what's happened here is these white males and these explorers from the Western world have come into Africa with their dark continent narrative and taken the Chipekwe as one specific creature. And it has later evolved into several because they wanted to diversify. They wanted to make more creatures surrounding the mysterious continent of Africa to give it some enigma, to give it some enigmatic nature. And I think even creatures like the water lion, cryptids like the water lion, have been referred to as Chipekwe. Now, the water lion is not rhino-like, nor does it have a horn, yet it's been referred to as a Chipekwe. How interesting. I mean, Chipekwe has multiple different variations. You know, you have Chipekwe, you have Chimpakwe, you have Chimpelwe, you know. So Chipekwe isn't just one word, nor is it just one creature. It's several. And I think the translations and the interpretations of the word Chipekwe have greatly developed over time. They've gone from water rhino with one horn to animal with multiple horns to just any water monster in Africa or around the world. Any water monster is a Chipekwe, or any monster is a Chipekwe. Owen Ledger, who was a animal hunter in history in the early 1900s, he described in 1911 that the Chipekwe, or Chimpakwe, as he was told that it was called, was a water rhino with 3 horns as well this time. So much like Carl Hagenbeck's account, who believed it to be sauropod-like, this account by Owen Letcher said that it was a rhino-like animal, but with 3 horns instead of 1. Yet the Ichisonga, which is a cryptid that almost developed from the Chipekwe, was a 1-horned animal that killed hippos, much like the earlier reports of the Chipekwe. And then Chipekwe came to mean multiple things. It came to mean Amelontuka. It came to mean water lion. It came to mean Mekele Mbembe. It came to mean Nsanga. And so my point is, I suppose anything goes, really, in relation to this Chipekwe creature. I think it's an umbrella term misinterpreted as a term that links to one specific animal. And I think these reports have been exaggerated by white explorers from the Western world who just wanted a story out of Africa and wanted to reinforce the idea that Africa was a primitive continent.